Niels Harrit, Professor Dr. Niels Harrit, has served as an associate professor of chemistry at the University of Copenhagen and is the author of more than 60 published peer-reviewed papers. Since 2007, he has been actively involved in the global movement for 9/11 truth, demanding an independent investigation of the attacks of September 11. Niels Harrit is the lead author of a scientific paper published in April 2009 describing the findings of active thermitic material in the dust from the collapses of the World Trade Center, buildings 1, 2, and 7, and he is a member of the 9/11 consensus panel. Over the years, Niels Harrit has given over 400 presentations on the collapse of the World Trade Center skyscrapers in many countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Germany, Australia, Russia, and Iceland. China as well. Niels, I know you are determined from the start. We really appreciate it. And it's very important that we have universities promoting the truth, because a lot of the universities don't have the courage to do it. And if they don't start to discuss this in an honest way, they shoot themselves in the foot. Because actually we have enough professors that lost their job because they tell the truth about 9/11 that we can start a university ourselves, and maybe we do that. That's an idea of Barbara, by the way.
Thanks a lot.
And we will hire Niels.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. My presentation is, I have called The Chemistry of 9/11, and I will hope to reach a coherent collapse scenario for the Twin Towers. And I will start by pointing at the NIST report on the Twin Towers, which came out in 2005. 10,000 pages, or somebody says 14,000 pages. It is a strategy the Americans called, they ain't never gonna read all that. Tin rat. No, you're not supposed to do it. It's dead meat and hot air, all of it. What you read is the main summary, 475 pages, and you go along and you reach chapter 6, which is called the probable collapse sequence. And then you are enlightened, because now I'm going to learn how the Twin Towers collapsed. And you start reading and you get a feeling that it is not really there. You reach page 82 and footnote number 13, which in my opinion is one of the most important footnotes since World War II. And it reads like this: the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. Now, this is academic terror, because you have to read it twice or three times. I had to myself, until I laughed out loudly, because what this means is that the technical report on the collapse of the Twin Towers, their timelines stop at the moment the towers are prone to collapse. That is, there is no official technical account for the collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. There is none. They do not cover the collapse. They describe the situation up until the moment of collapse, and then they leave it to gravity to do the rest of the work. And that is the key word actually in my presentation here, gravity. Because this is what you see, what billions of people in the world have seen of the collapse of the Twin Towers. And what do you see? You see debris being ejected horizontally out from the Twin Towers. And these are not minor things. These are actually huge. This is a steel beam, somebody says 20 tons. It's, in my opinion, too much. Let's say 15 tons, which are being ejected 100 meters and actually hitting the World Finance Center across the street, horizontally. Here we are 200 meters from the North Tower, And these are fragments the size of about 4 tons being ejected horizontally out from the Twin Tower. Now, this is not gravity. I'm looking for an object to demonstrate that gravity is vertical. Okay? So, yeah. That's it. Game over. We are finished. If you want to assure somebody that the official story is wrong, this is all you need, because everybody knows about gravity. Now, if you want some academic icing on the cake, you may refer to Sir Isaac Newton, who in 1687 published the most important book in science. It's called Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. I can't read it myself because I don't read Latin, and it's stuffed with equations and mathematics. But in there are the 3 laws of motions by Newton. There's never been any deviations from Newton's laws of motions. Newton's second law of motion reads, force equals mass times acceleration. But these are vectors, and a vector is something with a direction. So the force has a direction, and so has the acceleration, meaning that the acceleration goes in the same direction as the force. In plain English, an object moves in the direction of the force. So if you want some academic icing on this conclusion about gravity, you can refer to Isaac Newton. And notice a truth in science, it is that a theory cannot be wrong twice. I mean, if it's wrong, it's wrong. It cannot be wrong a second time. So this is all you need. So the official narrative is that the Twin Towers came down due to gravity only. For this argument, it's completely irrelevant whatever preceded this situation. Hijackings, airliners, jet fuel, impact, it doesn't matter. Because when the towers came down, for official story, it was only gravity doing the work. Now, we may stop here if this is what we only want, to prove that the official theory is wrong. But naturally, we start asking, then what happened then? Which means that we had to look for another force. And in order to explain that, I will introduce you now to something called energetic materials. These are chemicals which naturally contain some energy. They can do things. And the most common recognized chemical of energy are explosives. And we have them out here. An explosive is a chemical reaction which produces gas very quickly. So you have an enormous pressure very quickly, and it can do things. The oldest kind of explosive is gunpowder. It was invented by the Chinese in the 9th and 10th century. More than 1,000 years ago, the Chinese invented gunpowder. It's a mixture of pulverized charcoal, sulfur, and a chemical called saltpeter, potassium nitrate. You can dig it out from the ground if you are fortunate, if you have it occasionally in the country. If you don't, it can be substituted with chicken shit, like the Danes had to do in the Middle Ages, so we lost all our wars. But nevertheless, if you have these 3 chemicals and you have this powder, you have, and I'm sorry I have to bother you with a little chemical equation here, because here you have carbon and sulfur and saltpeter, and you're producing gases. This is carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. This is done very fast. And to demonstrate that an explosive can move things, I'll play a video I love. Because this is the German school class which have made their own homemade gunpowder in the science class, and now they are putting it into a little gun and a potato to demonstrate the effect of gunpowder.
Ja, kommt der Sache näher.
Echt? What a release. But gunpowder, it's going on in a chemical reaction is electrons are being moved from one agent, from one chemical to the other one. In this case, electrons are being moved from the carbon and the sulfur onto the saltpeter. Now, these are particles, so the electrons have to move a long distance, actually. This is a mixture you're making macroscopically, you're mixing the different powders, so the electrons have to go a long way. So gunpowder is not particularly fast, and it can be used for fireworks, right? And if it was a real explosive, you could make rockets. There were fireworks last night out here in the park, wonderful. And believe me, if it was a real explosive, they would have exploded on the ground. So gunpowder is not particularly fast. Actually, it should be characterized more like a propellant or rocket fuel. You can use gunpowder in rockets. And the propellant is also a chemical, an energetic material where gases are being produced, but not so fast as in explosives, because we don't want the rocket to explode, right? So it's burning from the surface, not so fast, milliseconds. It's still fast for us, but it's not fast for explosives. So the second type of energetic material I'll present here now are propellants. And they, but in ordinary explosives, we cannot use propellants for explosives. So the chemists have made a whole range of real explosives. We call them molecular explosives. And one example of this is this chemical here, which is called cyclotrimethylene nitramine, and it has the code name RDX. And it's very good for cutting steel. You can see this column here is being cut by that. And the key feature of this chemical is that the electrons doesn't have to move so far. It only has to move from this nitrogen to this nitrogen. And so the RDX is very, very fast. The combustion zone is moving at a speed more than 8,000 meters per second, which is about 20 times the speed of sound. So the bang is breaking the sound barrier. It's really noisy and it's hurting the ears, but it's cheap and it's very efficient. Now that is what molecular explosives can do. They're extremely fast. They are not particularly energetic. It's a mistake, but they're fast. So here we are with the explosives, which are very fast, propellants, which are not so fast. The third category of energetic materials I'll show you are incendiaries. And incendiaries are something which makes a lot of heat very fast. And the best known incendiary, at least in this crowd probably, is thermite. It was invented by a German chemist called Hans Goldschmidt in 1893. He recognized that if he made a mixture of iron oxide, and if you are being disturbed by chemical structures, you may say it's rust. There are many kinds of iron oxides, and one of them is rust, and it would work just as well. But you pulverize your iron oxide and you pulverize aluminum. These are two mixtures, like sugar and flour, that you just mix. Hans Goldschmidt did that in 1983. And he found out that if you can get the reaction going, it's not so easy. But when it goes, it's really violent. And you are producing iron at a temperature of 2,500 degrees centigrade and beyond. There are many varieties of the thermite reactions, hundreds actually. Some of them even go to 4,000 degrees centigrade if you use other metal oxides. But it can destroy things because it's 1,000 degrees beyond the melting point in steel. And to demonstrate what thermite can do, well, first let me show you this picture. This is a commercial thermite mixture, actually, which Professor Stephen Jones is firing in his lab. And what you should notice here, there are two products from the classical thermite reaction. And that is molten iron. I should have shown you in the previous slide here. And the other one is aluminum oxide. And it's a white powder. So from the classical thermite reaction, there are two products, iron and aluminum oxide. And aluminum oxide is white. You see here, this is the white cloud up here. Very important, please remember, aluminum oxide is white. Now, what can thermite do? I'll demonstrate this. This is a British, actually, college student, high school students who are working on a French car.
This is thermite. It's a powdered mixture of iron oxide and aluminium, which when ignited burns at 2,500 degrees Celsius, which is very, very hot. This is a car. It's been specially chosen to be destroyed because it's old, it's white, but more importantly, because it's French. The engine block is the densest part of a car. It's basically a huge lump of metal, and, well, it's very hard to melt. Lucky then, the brainiacs have plenty of thermite, specially packed into the slow-release mechanism of a garden flower pot. A big pile on the bonnet directly over the engine block should do the trick. Time to light the fuse and give this homage to French engineering the send-off it so richly deserves. The irreversible thermite reaction begins. Within seconds, the fiery concoction eats through the bonnet, spraying molten thermite into the engine beneath. The devastation continues inside until finally a torrent of white-hot liquid metal pours out of the bottom, signaling the inevitable victory for thermite. A quick check confirms a clear path of destruction through the engine.
Now, there are many varieties of thermite. One of them is thermate, which is used for military purposes. And what you do there is you add sulfur to the mixture. And sulfur makes what is called a eutectic mixture with iron, which lowers the melting point of the steel to a maximum, eventually, 1,000 degrees, 992 degrees centigrade. And you may add other things. You may add many things, actually, but barium nitrate will speed up the reaction, so you can use it, actually, for military purposes in torpedoes and grenades. Torpedoes are burning through the side of the ship. So thermate burns through steel like a hot knife through butter. And to illustrate that, I have a little advertising here, a little device you can buy if you need to get rid of the summer house when you're on vacation. And it's very convenient for doing that. You can operate it with your cell phone on a long distance, so nobody will realize what's going on. It's very... That's it. Zoop! Go through. And this is how what thermite can do on a steel beam. In this case, it's a small one, but it can do it on bigger ones as well. But when you use thermite on steel, you leave a trace of sulfur, because the sulfur is actually reacting with the iron in the steel. And this revelation came out, it's a paper which came out very early. Very few are aware of this, because they think it showed up in the FEMA report a year later. But it was actually published in December of 2001, very early. FEMA made a mistake, a slip. They submitted 3 steel beams to some workers on Worcester Institute of Technology. Jonathan Barnett and his co-workers here are metallurgists, so they could look at the steel beam, and they published this paper in Journal of Metals, Materials and Minerals. It's a regular scientific paper. And it was called An Initial Microstructural Analysis of a Steel Beam from the World Trade Center Building 7. But they also had steel beams from the 2 Twin Towers. It doesn't matter. And you may have seen this picture before, because it is actually outrageous this steam is razor thin and is filled with holes like Swiss cheese. And but what they do is they cut slices which are incredibly thin, which permits them to subject the slice to an electron microscope. And from that, you don't have to understand the details here, but the point is this FeS is iron sulfide. It means that there has been a reaction between sulfur and iron. There's another picture here. Here you see the sulfur peak indicating that you have sulfidation of the steel. This is an unambiguous proof that thermate was also used on the demolition of the World Trade Center Twin Towers, besides explosives, which we have heard in abundance in Richard's presentation. There were explosives all over, but there was always used steel beam cutters. And there are many patents in the literature on devices which can do that. Cutter charges. I could show 10, 15. This is just one for an example. And this is from 2001. And this is a patent. There are many military patents, and they're harder to get onto. So this is a well-known way of doing things. Now, of cutting steel beams using cutter charges with thermate. But thermate and thermite is still slow. And the reason for that is it's a macroscopic mixture of particles. So the electrons still have to move a long distance. They have to move from the aluminum, or aluminium as you call it in Europe, aluminium to the iron. So how do you get around that? Enter nanotechnology. It's a new branch of science which came in the 80s and the early 90s. And the trick here is that you make the materials from the bottom up. You make the chemistry do the work for you. And as a consequence, the individual particles, the components of the material are much smaller, 1,000 times smaller than you can do just by grinding it. So it means, this is illustrated here. This is an ordinary mixture, but in nanotechnology, you can, the chemistry is doing the work for you, so the components are much smaller. Here's aluminum and iron oxide, and everything is embedded in a polymer matrix, which is the secret, what the polymer matrix is. And this has been, it means that the combustion speed is going up dramatically, illustrated here. The time is getting shorter and shorter, the smaller the particles are, because the electrons have to move shorter and shorter distances. Now military use of technology started in the early 90s, in particular in Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, but eventually it spread all over. This is from a conference in 2001. At this point in time, all the military services and some Department of Energy and academic laboratories have activated R&D programs aimed at exploiting the unique properties of nanomaterials that have potential to be used in energetic formulations for advanced explosives and propellants applications. That is, the thermite reaction has much more energy than the molecular explosives. So the trick is to use the energy of the thermite reactions and convert it into an explosive by adding something which can produce a gas. Another reference from that is, this is MIT, which has a field called MIT, it's hard to see, MIT Technology Review here. They say that the new way of making explosives, and this is nanotechnology and thermite, they are smaller, cheaper, and nastier. These are the guiding principles behind the military's latest bombs. The secret ingredient, nanotechnology, that makes for a bigger boom. The military is also trying to make sure that its bullets kill quickly. And then there's a quote from one of the private companies doing these things. They say, getting the government to change the way they kill people is difficult. So they have the problem of selling this new technology, but it exists, and this started in the early 1990s. So this is overview here. We introduced incendiaries, and when you go down into nanotechnology, they are all fast, because this is what the nanotechnology can do. Now over to a paper which was published on April 3rd in 2009, together, or Stephen Earl Jones, I'll acknowledge him later, Jeffrey Farah, Kevin Ryan, and yours sincerely, came out with this eventually well-known discovery of the nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust. I'm not going into detail why this is truly a thermitic material, because that's another presentation. But it is. I will focus on the possibility that this material can indeed produce a gas. It's hard to demonstrate because they are so small. I have 3 qualitative indications of that. One thing is it's a lousy video where the experimentalist is having a microtorch and is hitting one of these, about 1/10 of a millimeter of these chips. They're very, very small. And there is, you will see here that there is actually how the chip is reacting. There's a yellow, it's hitting his hand. So there definitely, this nanothermite can move, okay? It's not an incendiary, purely incendiary. It can move things. Another thing is, this is a chemist called Mike Basil, who put the chip under a microscope. And so he could observe it during ignition. He put it on a hot plate and heated it up. And you'll see it here. Eventually, I'll push again. Here you go. It's a red part of it, which is interesting. But the point here is that it's swelling. So there's a gas being produced. Okay? And the third evidence for that is Kevin Ryan, a colleague and dear friend of mine, and he is making nanothermite hone in his garden. This is not the same material as we have found in the World Trade Center dust. We cannot reproduce that because we don't know the polymer. But Kevin used actually a public recipe for making nanothermite from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My colleagues at the military laboratories, they always also have to brag and submit reports and apply for funding. So we know, we completely understand the chemistry. And Kevin could do that. And this is the last seconds of his preparation of nanothermite, where he's heating up the beaker on a hot plate. And it's blowing off the lid. And of course, you may think that the heat makes the air expand and is blowing off the lid, which is true. But there is a gas released here, and I can show you the chemical reaction in the break if you wish. And it's carbon dioxide, so it's not politically correct to do that. But it is carbon dioxide being released here, so it's blowing off the lid. So if we go back to the World Trade Center and start looking, and this was David Chandler, who's actually made for many years, I couldn't see where the nanothermite fit into the collapse picture. And it was this video which, right, here we go. Now I see what you can see.
This is the destruction of the South Tower of the World Trade Center, viewed from a helicopter to the south. This particular video clip is rich in details that call the official story into question. Notice the numerous explosions on the west side of the building above the impact point. As the top 30-floor section falls, it tips to the east. It starts off intact, but then it disintegrates in midair. Gravity alone could not cause the top section to disintegrate. When an object is in free fall, there are no internal stresses. It should have hit the ground in one piece, but it didn't. Some of the debris is clearly being accelerated by forces other than gravity. These effects can be caused by late firing explosives, which can produce a white smoke trail. White smoke, consisting of aluminum oxide, is a byproduct of the thermite reaction. While producing this video, I ran across one rocket projectile I had not seen commented on before. This one stopped midair and changed directions. Even taking perspective effects into account, this projectile lost one component of momentum and gained another. That requires an impulse. Note that the rocket trail does not point back to the building, but the point where the impulse occurred. Let's take it from the top. There's a lot going on. Watch for the smoking guns.
Yeah, and David has done some extra work on this specific projectile on the right, which is clearly viewable because it's on a background, on a dark background, which is important.
For this object to radically change directions like this,
really
it had to experience a sudden impulse. We know there was a large amount of unreacted nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust. That was confirmed in a paper published in the Chemical Physics Journal in April 2009. Thermite reactions produce aluminum oxide, which is visible as white smoke, and nanothermite is explosive. Nanothermite is stable when wet and can be literally painted onto steel beams. Nanothermite painted onto this chunk of material would explain the explosion, producing the sudden change of direction, and it would also explain the white smoke trail. When we zoom in, we can see that the path zigzags, indicating multiple small explosions. Once I found this projectile, I looked for it in other videos. I found it in several videos from different angles, but when shown against the backdrop of the white debris cloud, it is very hard to see. This is another video from a very similar perspective to the first. In this shot, the trail can be seen to persist all the way down to the bottom of the collapse. We can learn several things from the behavior of this projectile. First, it is clear that this chunk carries explosive material with sufficient power to drastically change its momentum in a short outburst. Secondly, it is clear that the smoke we see is not general smoke from the fires entrained in the wake of a moving object. Since the smoke trail follows the object in all of its twists and turns, it is clear that the smoke is being emitted from the object itself. The most obvious interpretation, of course, is we are seeing the results of nanothermite burning and undergoing explosive outbursts. Once we see this clear example of an object trailing smoke generated on its surface, we can reinterpret what we are seeing elsewhere. There are lots of chunks of falling debris trailing smoke clouds. In many cases, we can see long beams with smoke being emitted from the entire length of the beam. We no longer need to assume that this is following in their wake. When we see white smoke that looks as though it's coming from the girders, it is reasonable to assume that we are in fact seeing smoke coming from material painted onto the girders themselves. When we see chunks that race ahead of the rest of the falling debris, as we see near the bottom of this view, we can reasonably interpret this as caused by explosive impulses that increase the speed of these objects, just as they change the direction of the one we've been studying. It is time to take off the blinders. We have not only chemically detected nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust, we are literally seeing nanothermite in action. Once our eyes are open, we can see it wherever we look.
This is not wallboard being thrown out. It will not carry a white smoke trail, and this is not concrete. There is a reaction going on. I'm frequently being asked, if these towers were loaded with explosives and incendiaries, why didn't they go off when the airliners hit? And I have located, actually, they did. Watch this. This is before, what's going on here? Look, wow, zuk, zuk, zuk. This is ridiculous. So it is going off. And here's another one.
Trying to go off.
Look at that one.
I love you, bud.
It's pretty good, actually.
I will. We are. I got somebody with me. We're fine. Bye.
And finally, just a little clip from another Davis work. This is a consequence of a meeting we had in Toronto in 2011, the 10 years anniversary, where we spoke. And so he continued the work on this hypothesis. And he located many exploding fragments. The quality, of course, is not very good. But this is obviously, there's one
Watch the
exploding.
comet-like object at the
they're
far right
exploding.
in slow motion. It is the most easily viewed because it shows up against the blue sky.
So there's a fragment being
Let's
thrown
take
out.
it one frame at a time.
So what we're dealing with here is not a propellant and it is not an explosive. Due to the advent of nanotechnology, we are missing a term in between explosives and incendiaries. It is more explosive than propellants, in between explosives and propellants. It's more explosive than propellants, and it's not so explosive as explosives. But still, going back to the picture I showed you right before, once you see it, as David says, once you see it, it's abundant, it's obvious. This is what's going on. And you may ask why they had to move all the things. We may speculate why they had to do it this way, instead of just taking it down. I will not go into that. To make a coherent and non-contradictory collapse scenario for the Twin Towers, you need at least 3 kinds of energetic materials. We've just heard the abundant witnesses talking about explosions, and we've all heard the explosions. No doubt there were explosions being used. We do not know the chemical nature of these explosives. They could have been thermitic, or they could have been conventional. We do not know. But we know that the thermate, which was demonstrated by Jonathan Corbett, is a thermitic material. And I think that the nanothermite fits in nicely for illustrating the canopy of debris we saw in here. Maybe they had to move the bulk of material outside of the bathtub to avoid flooding of Manhattan. We don't know. Maybe it was simply just a shock and awe effect. And maybe the canopy, if you notice, the canopy covers actually what's really going on underneath. So this is, if you want a non-contradictory collapse model, you need 3 energetic materials. And the hard thing is, of course, for the world population to see what you see, because it's inherent in propaganda that the powers tell you what to see. And they can tell you that this is black, and everybody say, oh yes, it's very black, because this is what the master told you. And the master told you here that the powers came down due to gravity. And an example of how the audience are being primed prior to the collapse, I'll show you a short clips of the Danish Prime Minister on the late afternoon of September the 11th. He's coming to his office.
På samme tid træder daværende statsminister Poul Nyrup Rasmussen ind i statsministeriet for at holde et sikkerhedsrådsmøde.
Nogenlunde i det øjeblik, jeg træder ind i statsministeriet, får jeg at vide, at det første tårn er nu helt kollapset. Jeg får en melding, jeg tror 5-10 minutter før det fysisk sker, at nu er der overhængende risiko for, at tårnene kollapser. Så jeg vidste, at katastrofen var på vej, og får det så endelig bekræftet i det øjeblik, jeg træder ind, tror jeg, i huset.
What's going on here? You cannot predict or foresee something which has never happened before. You cannot forecast snow if it has never snowed. And still there's somebody here telling my prime minister that now in 5-10 minutes the towers will collapse. Yes, worth reminding. And this is, I will end here with acknowledgements. Very importantly, these 4 gentlemen, in particular Stephen Earl Jones, I hope he may be listening and take part of your appreciation in a short moment. He initiated the research into the nanothermite at Brigham Young University and carried out most of the experiments together with Geoffrey Farrer, the master of the electron microscope, which is a very important tool for what we did. And third, Kevin Ryan, he actually got me into this, and a friend and chemist as well and co-author, and David Chandler should be appreciated for his brilliant work on videos and for opening our eyes to so many obvious things. And by these words, I would thank you for your attention.